Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the HR Leaders Podcast. Today, we have a special episode for you guys. We actually have a workshop here live on LinkedIn. You're spoiled. You had one yesterday. We had another one today. We're back with another Christopher. This time, we're joined by a good friend, Christopher Rossett, who's the Senior HR Director for Analytics and Reporting at Comcast. Chris, welcome to the show. How are you?
Well, how are you guys today?
I'm good. Thanks for joining us. We made it happen. We're here as well. So it's funny when we was having a chat last night, and you told me, Chris, I was one of your first ever podcast guests. I was like, wow, 2 years has gone pretty fast.
Yeah, it has.
So I think last time I spoke to you, I wasn't even a dad at that time. So it's glad to catch up with you. Before we jump in, tell everyone a little bit about yourself personally and sort of your journey to where we are today.
Yeah, for sure. So I've got some slides on that I'll get to in a little bit. But my name is Chris. Hi, everybody. Tuning in from LinkedIn. Very excited to be with everyone today. I'm from the U.S., Northeast Corridor. Grew up right outside of New York City. Got into IO psychology and then ultimately into HR, where I've spent my time in stuff like organizational development, HR analytics, talent management, talent acquisition, and things like that. I'm not so in the closet nerd. I love all things having to do with people science. And so over the last few years, I've really been focusing my career on this new thing that is HR analytics. I've been really fortunate to work at some really great companies like PepsiCo and Verizon, and now Comcast, NBC, Universal, Sky. And so I'm excited to share with you guys some of the work that I did when I was back at Verizon to help move us in a more mature direction with our HR analytics.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone saw the words machine learning and they just stopped and tuned in.
It is a hot topic, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, so before we jump in, guys, as if you're new to the workshops we have here on live on LinkedIn, during the presentation from Chris, you are able to ask questions. I'm actually monitoring the LinkedIn feed, so we're happy to feed them through as well. If you have any questions for us, we're approximately going to do sort of a 30 to 40-minute presentation, and then we're going to jump into a Q&A at the end as well. So plenty of time to get your questions over if you want that. Apart from that, let's jump in to the presentation.
Yeah, sounds good. And like Chris said, guys, feel free to live comment as you go. Chris and I have talked about his free reign to interrupt me, and I would love to handle questions in the moment because that's really, really super helpful. So anything you guys have to say, more than interested in hearing about. So the objectives that we're going to get through today are all going to be framed, as you can see on this top line, through the lens of one set of frontline analytics projects. I feel like a lot of times when we talk about machine learning or AI, we try to create this abstract framework that's going to work for everybody. But I think that these sorts of conversations really need to have the context. So we're going to talk about how it worked in one place. We're going to do a little philosophy, but I think that color commentary is going to help maybe make it a little stickier for you. Maybe it'll resonate with you. Some of it will, some of it won't. But we're going to talk about kind of three main things. One is how we evolve from descriptive to predictive, and then from predictive to prescriptive. We're going to talk about evolving HR data from disjointed and siloed to a little bit more integrated that helped run some of that machine learning stuff for us. And then we're going to, as the title insinuates, introduce some very basic machine learning techniques that we used, as well as some that didn't work so hot, and how they can kind of easily be applied in your organizations soon. So with that, let's jump in. So the intros, I'm going to talk about myself and my role a little bit, just so you guys know who I am and where I come from. We're going to talk about foundations for the advanced. I almost never talk about machine learning without the infrastructure that goes underneath it, right? You can't just pull machine learning out of the ether. It has to be based on something. So we're going to talk a little bit about HR philosophy, data ecosystems, and kind of how you add value while you show value, which is really what sets the stage to get you to a place where you can do machine learning. So first things first, if you recognize any of these brands, this is one large company now. You may have heard of Comcast. You may have heard of NBC. You may have heard of Universal, and you may have heard of Sky if you're in Europe.
If you're like me in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. So Comcast, NBC, Universal has been one company for several years now. I talk about this as in water and pipes, right? So Comcast are your pipes that enable all the infrastructure to bring media into your home, right? This is your internet provider. They're your cable provider. They do all of the technology, cybersecurity, network infrastructure that keeps those pipes working. And then NBC and Universal are a little bit more about the water that goes through those pipes, right? So the content that you want to see, Sunday Night Football, Telemundo, Sci-Fi Network, all of those great content providers that bring that stuff in that you guys want to have in your home. I'm oversimplifying a little. The Comcast group also has things like Spectacor, which owns the Philadelphia Flyers, and Business Ventures, and other things like that. And Universal has parks, right, like Universal Studios. So Comcast's NBCU is a very cool place to live. We literally have people on trucks helping connect you, and we have people designing roller coasters, right, all under the same umbrella.
That is pretty crazy.
It's pretty cool. And then Sky is a European, somewhat equivalent to the Comcast NBC Universal family. They also provide content, and they also provide infrastructure. Although I'm going to stay away from talking too much about that because I don't know too much about it, honestly. Other than that, we're really excited to be partnered now under one big umbrella. So a little bit about me. I'm at Comcast now. I work on that cable side of the business. Specifically, I support all the technologists. So all the folks that are building and maintaining that network, designing the award-winning technology like the remote control that you can talk to, and building all of the software interfaces that you guys use for Xfinity Home or for cable or for internet. I've worked at 3 Fortune 500s throughout my career, started at PepsiCo, then moved to Verizon Wireless, where I was frontline focused on retail and customer care. And now, like I said, on the cable part of the Comcast NBCU Sky family. I've also worked at some small companies in my formative years. And like I said before, huge nerd. So PSYOP, SHRM, APA, all stuff that I love. I go to their conferences, I read their journals. And so kind of try to keep my hand or my feet in both camps, right? On the working side, been in L&D, workforce management or development. On the academic side, stuff like PE Fit, or communication, generational differences. And of course, a little bit, I wouldn't consider myself a huge expert, but love me some machine learning. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. All right, so let's start with the foundations for the advanced, where we're going to talk about analytics philosophy a little bit. If you're already an analytics professional, this might be a little elementary, but it'll at least give us some common language that we're going to work off of as we talk through. Then the HR data ecosystem. This is kind of general across most organizations. Hopefully this will resonate with you if you work with data. And then finally, the way that we've built the bridge. We're going to talk specifically about how those two things came to life at Verizon as we were trying to get towards this machine learning space. So the first thing I like to talk about when we talk about analytics, because most people at the end of the day are still not HR analytics professionals, right? They're HR folks that have been in HR for a long, long time. And they say, what is this analytics thing? Why do we do it? Why is it important? And I always start with this cycle. So on the left side where we see source, you have to get information. That is the number one step. If you're going to do anything with data, you need to have data and you have to get it. You have to make sure it's valid and reliable. You have to make sure it's sustainable. So getting data is a huge part of what we do. Once you have your hands on it, you get to explore it, right? Some people call this interrogating your data or learning the soul of your data. You've got to get in and play with it and see what you see. And once you understand your data, then you can start to describe what your data says. You can start to make diagnoses about pain that you may have in your organizations, or you may be able to predict outcomes based on the way things are today. And that's where you really start to drive value for your organizations. But you can only drive that value if you could communicate it, right? You have to know what you want to say, but then you have to say it in a way that's effective, right? And that's where concepts like data visualization and dashboarding and the IT part of uploading stuff and making it fit for your users and communications theory really becomes important to the analytics equation. Once you do that really well, people make decisions and they act. And that's where we hand it off more to the business for them to decide, you got the data, you learned about it, you explained to me what the problem was, now I'm going to change the way I do things. And that last arrow is probably the most important, the one right here, because that is ultimately going to impact the data that you source, right? Because when you make that change, the outcome that you ultimately explored is going to fundamentally shift. This honestly is just kind of a corporate version of the scientific method, right? I see a thing, I make a hypothesis about the thing, I change the way I do the thing, and then it makes a positive or negative impact on the way things were on that status quo. And so that's at the end of the day what analytics people do, right? We just help facilitate this process with evidence, which is really, I think, super exciting because it moves us out of the space of emotional gut and into the space of evidence-based decision making.
Yeah. Which of these areas do you see that are normally the biggest point of failure for most organizations?
I would say it's probably in the sustainable sourcing. And I say sustainable very specifically. So the biggest challenge, I think, is that we want to do the describing, the diagnosing, and the predicting, and we want to communicate it before we have a solid foundation on the sourcing and the exploring. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of like building a house without a foundation, right? You can put it up, but it's probably going to fall down. It's going to shift a bunch. It's going to be confusing to work within. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how you have to do the describe and diagnose while you do the sourcing part. But I would say they get the cart before the horse. If I had to pick one thing, that would be it. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I break up HR analytics in general, but I'm going to start with this question. I want you guys to think about this for a quick second. If you had to put all the different things you do as an HR analyst or an HR analytics leader into buckets, how many discrete categories would you say you do? If somebody said, how many things do you do? I'm going to give you about 10 seconds or so. Think through that, throw your answer in the comments, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about a model that I like to use that might be helpful. I'm going to set a timer here.
Set a timer for them.
Yeah.
We have to account for the LinkedIn stream delay for my responses to you.
Oh, fair enough.
I'm only joking, but there is a 30-second delay, but it doesn't matter. They'll come through anyway, so it's not a problem.
All right. So hopefully you guys have your answer. And the reason I want to talk about this is the foundation for how you're going to prioritize and triage your work going forward. You may have a model of this of your own that you use. I use this because it really helps me differentiate me and my teams what we do, but also in a lot of ways what we choose actively not to do. And how we prioritize what's most important to our organizations. So this is intentionally a pyramid, and it starts at the bottom. I say we do 5 things. That's the world of HR analytics according to Chris.
Some people have put 10 plus in there.
Oh yeah, yeah. When we interview, I ran this as a poll once, and I think about 10% of people said 10 plus.
Really?
Most people were in like the 6 to 10 was really the more common.
Got a few 10 pluses here.
Yeah, so I'm sure it definitely feels like that to me some days, that we do 30, 40, 50 things. But I'm going to try to break it down to 5 for y'all today. Yeah. So the first is infrastructure, and that is the really back end the IT part of this, the structures, the data warehouses, the architecture, the ones and zeros. Where does stuff live? How does it get manipulated? And how do you get access to it? The next rung up is something that I call governance, which is the rules of engagement. So this includes all your definitions, your refresh schedules, who owns the data, who has jurisdiction over things, who gets to define things. Once they get to define the thing, how is the thing defined, ethics, and other processes that go along with, now that we have the data, what are the rules that we need to do to use this data well and consistently? The next 3 up are really where we start to use information, right? So the guidance is the counsel and support we provide to users about workforce data to help them do what they need to do. So someone comes and says, I have a turnover problem, help me fix it. I have a leadership quality problem, help me prove it. This is where we have to be consultants in a lot of ways as HR analytics folks, where we're diving into the business, we're probing, and we're helping solve problems and operationally define pain in a way that we can then go back and define it and solve it using and provide evidence using data. The last 2 are the ones that most people are familiar with, reporting and analytics. I intentionally split those out. Reporting is giving people data. Analytics is helping people interpret their data, right? Reporting is 10 people quit last month. Analytics is 10 people quit last month because you have a leader management problem and your competitor down the street just raised their minimum wage by 10%, right? And it's very, very different. Reporting is one thing because it's really just knowing the systems well enough to pull valid, reliable data out and give it to somebody. Analysis requires a whole nother level of business understanding because then you have to make sense and tell stories with the information that you're reporting. So I always separate these 2 things out. Analytics is obviously penultimate, but reporting is bread and butter in a lot of ways from a reporting perspective. All right, so now that we know about what we do, let's talk about the environment in which we do it. This is the data ecosystem that I talk about with folks when they talk about, well, don't dashboards, why can't you just build me a dashboard, right? Well, dashboards are a very complicated thing because they're the tip of the iceberg. They're the 5% that the users interact with. The rest of it is underneath the water and goes all the way back to this more technical level. And if you're a true IT professional on here, I apologize for the gross oversimplification. But the metaphor I like to use for people is breaking it into 3 categories, right? The refrigerator, the kitchen, and then the table. Because data really goes through these 3 sections, no matter how you want to use it, no matter what industry. You've got data living in tables, the rows and the columns. That's like the food in the refrigerator. Then you've got all the rules about what people can see. That's the business layer. That's where you're applying your first layer of logic. You're filtering, you're creating dependencies, you're providing security, you're doing all the things that regulate what comes out of the refrigerator, and you're preparing it to ultimately go to the table. And that's the presentation layer. That's the part where your users are clicking and dragging and actually interfacing with the data to get the insights that they need. Um,
Detlef in the comments, just so you know, Detlef, no, it's not recorded. This is live. So if you have any questions, Detlef, you can ask them now. So
yes, please do. Whoever
Yeah.
you are, ask away. We're happy to answer.
Yeah.
Um,
It was so well rehearsed that everyone's actually thought it was pre-recorded.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Take a compliment.
Take it as a compliment. So where do our users fit into this, right? Because now we're starting to talk about the environment and the partnerships that are really going to impact your ability to do machine learning well, right? So there's a chasm here that's really intentional. At the top, you have your users and your super users. Your users are your regular folks that are using the data on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes we confuse super users for IT professionals, but super users are just people that either have expanded permissions or extraordinary skill with the presentation layer. They're not very often true IT professionals in that they're not writing code, they're not influencing the back end, they're really just using the software way better than anybody else. Where you want to be as an HR person or HR analytics person is kind of in this middle space, more IT than the super user, but more user than the IT folks. And the reason for that is that you have to ensure the usability of the data, which the users and super users care about. You need to care about the validity, the validity and the reliability. Validity, by the way, is accuracy. Reliability is consistency, right? So those are different concepts, but both equally important when you're talking about analytics and data in general. And that doesn't necessarily rely, the IT folks don't really understand validity, they understand reliability. And the super users really care about, the super users care about validity more, the IT folks care about reliability more. You have to care about both if you really want to nail this overall value add. And then finally, sustainable infrastructure. Every HR analytics team I've ever talked to is understaffed. And if you're not moving towards sustainability, you're moving towards burnout. And so getting stuff to be sustainable is a critical part of advancing the maturity of your analytics group.
Fantastic.
And if I'm giving you guys examples, right, here are the sorts of folks that you end up talking to in these spaces, right? HR business partners, finance, legal, the business. These are the users that you want to see. From a super user perspective, this is often HR operations. A lot of folks in HRIS, the HR information systems team, sometimes they're IT people, but sometimes they're super users. And then the COEs work a lot with their own versions of data. And then on the IT side, database administrators, engineers, front-end developers, back-end developers. These are the people that are probably not in an IT or not in an HR vertical. So very important to keep a handle on who these different partners are. To complicate things further, we don't always or ever have one of these versions of reality, right? So in a world of any medium to large size organization, you're going to have this refrigerator, kitchen, table concept for multiple different systems. You'll have one for employee information where you get your demographics and your job levels and your titles. You'll have another for talent management where goals and performance ratings are stored. One for compensation, one for applicant tracking, one for learning and development, one for leave of absence possibly, right? And on and on and on. And these verticals have to get stuck together in a way that you can get insight out of them. But in order to do that, we're often in this space where we're pulling things constantly and trying to, bubblegum and duct tape them together in order to get the insight to fix the problem of the day. So this is just kind of the reality of the framework that we have to live in. So here's an example of a real slide that we used to build the business case to kind of solve that problem. And so now instead of going from kitchen from refrigerator to kitchen to table, going bottom to top, we're going from left to right here. But we really use this to explain to our business leaders how we needed to do this at Verizon Wireless. So on the left-hand side, we had data that was not owned by HR, but was within our Verizon systems, but we didn't have access to it. We needed to bring it in to the left where we have the pink cylinders there, where we got them all aligned and connected. Because once you do that at the IT level, now all of a sudden that data is very easy to recall. It's very easy to chop up. It's very easy to prep for something like more advanced analytics and machine learning. Once we did that, we kind of distilled it out into two essentially giant tables, one for retail, one for customer service. We added all of our metadata, which is the data we calculate from data. So if I want to take hire date and I want to subtract current date, and that gives me a metric that I call tenure, right? How long you've been at the organization. That's an example of metadata. And then from there, now we have a distilled source of truth from which we can go to the front end with. We can go to Tableau, we can go to SPSS, we can go to Cognos if we want a table or a stat analysis or a dashboard. And so this flow from left to right is a really important way to build that business case for why you need it in order to be able to do more things with fewer sources.
Yeah, and
Does that kind of get at the question from before, Chris?
definitely, and also for everyone who keeps asking, yes, the slides and the recording will be available. So as soon as this ends, it's automatically available on demand on LinkedIn for those that you are new to LinkedIn.
Yeah. So you're saying it's not recorded now, but it's being recorded, so later it will be recorded.
Yeah, just to make it even more complicated.
All right.
Yes, that's how it for everyone as well. So yes, keep able to grab that.
All right, cool. So now let's rewind a little bit and put those two things together, right? So we were talking about that sourcing all the way down into the insights generation, but then we're also talking about this framework about what we do versus what we don't do. And I split this pyramid up, excuse me, into two places: the building versus the giving. The infrastructure governance and guidance is the building. It's that exploring and that sourcing that's so important part of that beginning of the cycle. But then after you build, you have to give, because otherwise, what's the point? And that's where the guidance, the reporting, and the analytics come in. Guidance kind of plays in both spaces because you're often building while you're explaining in the guidance phase. But the idea is that you kind of have to give and build. So my next question for you guys, to take a couple seconds and answer in the comments, is what should you do first as an analytics team? If you're new, if you just got some heads, where should you focus? Should you focus, one, on delivering short-term wins to your constituents to show your value? Or two, should you build systems and processes to ensure valid insights and sustained competitive advantage? Take a few seconds. I'm going to go back to my timer, and I'll be back with you guys in about 20 seconds. Comment away.
So one or two, guys, you can see the options there. And just while we're waiting on that, we had quite a few comments. Chris said, people said, thank you so much for making everything so simplified and easy to follow and understand.
Oh, cool. Good. I'm glad you guys like it.
For the people that are new to people analytics.
Great. Okay. So you guys probably aren't surprised, but the answer is kind of a little bit of both. When I've pulled this before, I almost always get a split. And the reason for that is that there's pros and cons to both. So let's talk about them a little bit. So if you over-index on either of these, you're going to kind of have a bad time. You need to balance between the two of them, and we're going to talk about how to do that so that you can get from simple short-term stuff to more advanced and machine learning type things, which requires more sophisticated levels of infrastructure. So the pros of delivering short-term wins is that it's faster, meaning you can deliver it much quicker from a calendar days perspective, and it's very understandable to the end user, right? So an end user can see it and say, oh, here is how you, analytics team, fixed my problem today. Great. They give you a pat on the head, they give you a raise, and you go off and you fix the next problem. So it provides a lot of short-term value. The cons of taking that approach and going too far in that direction is that it's not sustainable, right? You're redoing work over and over. Every time you get the same question or a slightly different version of the same question, you're doing a totally new analysis, and that's just not sustainable. It's also more error prone and not standard, because the more times a human touches something, the more likely it is it's going to be wrong, right? So the advantage is it's fast and it's custom and it's agile. The con is that it's kind of error prone and not standardized.
Well, based on your experience, where do people typically start?
People almost always have to start with number one. Mm-hmm. Unless you're coming into a world where you already have a ton of street credibility. An example might be, we're starting an analytics function for HR, and we're taking a senior vice president of advanced analytics and marketing, and we're giving her 5 heads and a few $1 million in a couple of years to stand something up. In that case, they might have the latitude and the organizational credibility to start more on 2. But that's not how most organizations have done this over the last few years. They hire a person or 2 people and say, start adding value. So you kind of need to start with 1 and then work your way into 2.
Yeah. I was wondering, because when you say deliver short-term wins, a lot of the leaders that I interview, one of the mistakes they tell me is that in the beginning, they try to solve too many problems and get so many short-term wins as opposed to looking at what's the biggest problem that business is facing right now and focus our attention there to build a business case around that particular challenge. Yeah,
I have a leader that used to say you got to put the spinach in the brownie, right? Like, you've got to give them what they want in the short term, but you got to make sure you're taking care of them long term as well. Mm-hmm. So that's a point well taken, Chris, for sure. On the flip side, that systems delivery part ensures that you get the sustainable, long-term, scalable, verifiable processes, which is really important, but it's entirely unsexy. You're not going to get a deck up in front of your board of directors and wow them with your data lake. Like, that's not going to be a thing. So the cons of that is that it's slower, right? It's opaque to the end users, and they get value, right? The value is less error. The value is quicker turnaround time. The value is more bandwidth, but it's indirect. And so it's a sell that has to be done carefully and differently and differentiated and balanced with the one, so that you can get both of those things done and prepare yourself and position yourself for the long term. All right. So I talked a lot about philosophy. I promise you guys to talk a little bit about specific, because I really think putting context around this is where it's going to resonate more, and where you're going to see how you may be able to bring this to life in your own organizations. So when I joined Verizon Wireless in 2013, I was brought on to this selection strategy and operations team, which is a team that sat in talent acquisition, and it was our job to make sure that our pre-hire assessments were working, right? So if you wanted to sell our products and services at Verizon Wireless, or you wanted to work in a call center, we gave you a test. And depending on how you did on that test, you either got an interview or you didn't get an interview, or we prioritized your interview. And in order to make sure that those things work, there's lots of regulations. The EEOC is a U.S. organization, a government organization that makes sure that hiring practices are equitable and fair. We had vendors that built and validated those assessments for us. We had internal stakeholders and leaders that wanted to know, and for us to prove, is this actually working and giving me the lift I hope it is? So they really needed, not so much is my assessment working, they needed a reliable, valid, and clean data feed, right, going all the way back to that source part of the equation, to satisfy all these different constituents that needed access to this data. So the way that was done in 2013 was we would go off and say, okay, we need to validate this retail assessment. I'm going to go grab some data from the retail performance data warehouse. I'm going to go grab some data from the HR data warehouse. I'm going to go grab some data from the leave of absence data warehouse. And I'm going to mush it all together, and I'm going to see, okay, do people who score better on the test do better in these performance outcomes? And multiply that by all of our different tests, all of our different employee groups, all of our different job codes. And we were sort of bringing all these little data sets together to build one model here, one model here, one model here, to validate all of these things. So
how are you doing this, by the way? So how are you doing this? Was it in an Excel spreadsheet?
We're talking, so on our side, where we were doing a lot of the validations, it was mostly in Excel. When we partnered with vendors, they would do slightly more advanced. So they would bring it into things like SPSS or Minitab or other statistical software if they were doing slightly more advanced inferential statistics.
Yeah, but I just wanted to let everyone know that you can do this stuff in Excel.
You could do some of it, yeah. If you're going to do real like EEOC compliance stuff, you want to be using statistical software. Mm-hmm. But for 95% of this, Excel is perfectly doable. Mm-hmm. So we said, look, guys, we get it. But if we could put all this data in one place and create a slightly more sustainable version of this, we could do a lot more, we could do faster, and we could do better. So then the question from them became, make sure we're hiring quality candidates. Because it's not really about the assessments at the end of the day, right? It's about the hiring decisions. And then we decided that, well, not only can we say, is this test working, but we could also say, are we getting better year over year? Are the people we're hiring today better than the people we were hiring yesterday? Meaning our tools and our processes for hiring are getting demonstrably better. Right? So now the need really had evolved to a valid means to compare new hires, right, to each other. So today's new hires versus yesterday's new hires, but then also to the incumbents in the organization and say, how are these folks doing compared to everybody else? And so that required us to create slightly more sophisticated models. So now, instead of bringing all these data models in together from lots of these different places to do one-off things, we're trying to bring it into a smaller group of data sets so that we could do more at once. That's the essence of it. And so once they saw that, they said, this is great. We now have interactive tools, and now we have things we can play with. Still Excel, Chris, by the way, still sitting on laptops and shared drives, but at least now it's somewhat centralized. So all of the different things are kind of being solved in one marketplace rather than in lots of different places. As soon as they saw that, they said, this is great. I want it more often. I want it faster. I want it cut more ways. And so now the bottleneck and the challenge became, yes, we like what you're doing and we like how it's being done, but we need more of it. And the problem stopped being how do we get the data together and started being how do we deliver it to people more quickly. So at that point, the business case had evolved, and we said, look, we were doing all these things off one hock. Now we have a small consolidated marketplace where we're giving you everything that you love. If you want it bigger, if you want it more standardized, if you want us to remove the bottleneck of a small number of users, we need to institutionalize this. We need to get IT involved. We need to start to build this in a way that's sustainable so that everybody can get what they need all of the time, and it doesn't need to be managed by a very, very small group of highly technical folks. And so they said, okay, yeah, you can do that. And so that was how the business case got built for us to move into the predictive turnover space. And you can see I have here, they didn't ask.
So you're talking about 3 years of work before you got to the stage, just for everyone, right?
Yes, yeah, for sure. Because the title of this slide is Building the Bridge While You Cross It, right? Because through all these 3 years, we're adding value. We're giving them quality of hire reports. We're validating assessment. We're making sure that we're getting better day in and day out. It's just working hard as opposed to working smart. But while you're doing the brownie part, you're getting the spinach, right, in there as well. And so once we had built that infrastructure, we built it for descriptive statistics. We built it for quality of hire analysis. So descriptive and basic inferentials. But as we're doing that design, we've always got this predictive turnover thing going in our mind, because once we build that infrastructure, now we have the foundation to do the more advanced stuff. So the more time I spend in HR analytics, the more I realize that HR business partners and business leaders really understand the storylines and what's going on in their business. What they lack in general is the systems and infrastructure to provide empirical evidence to support those business cases, right? I hear the business, HR, and finance going at each other all the time about things because they just don't have any hard evidence about which route is the right to take. Sometimes finance is right, sometimes HR is right, sometimes the business is right. But the idea is this infrastructure provided the breeding ground to be able to do the more advanced analytics. But we were only able to build that breeding ground by doing the short-term wins while we were slowly evolving towards the more advanced infrastructure.
How was HR brought into this picture, by the way, on this journey? What did that look like?
So the team that I was on technically reported up through HR, right? So at Verizon, talent acquisition was the selection strategy team reported up through senior vice president of HR. So my boss's boss was the vice president of HR. He was an HR business partner. Our main clients were TA, who reported up through a different vertical, but were peers of that group. So HR was brought along the whole way. I consider myself an HR person. I always have. Because what I'm doing is taking care of the human resources, right? But does that answer the question?
No, of course. I was just wondering what that looked like, and did the relationship with HR become more closer and closer and closer as you, in terms of educating the HR team along the way? Because it's very new for many. I'm sure what you're talking about is very new to many of the HR practitioners that you're working with.
Yeah. At the lower level, it's more about upskilling, right? Teaching them how to tell their own stories and helping them tell stories. At the higher level, it's more about selling business value, right? Why are you spending all this time and all this headcount building this thing that I'm never going to interact with? So you kind of have to moderate the business case, right? Down at the bottom, it's with them, right? How do I hire more people? What people should I be hiring or not hiring? At the top, it's more about the long-term stuff. How are we preparing ourselves for the future more effectively?
Great.
All right. So to summarize that whole concept, what we built and how it advanced over time, right? At the beginning, it's little prototypes. It's a prototype for this assessment, a prototype for this job code, a prototype for that. Then we said, let's stop doing the little prototypes and build one big prototype. Do you like that? Yes, we really like that. Okay, then let's take it off of Chris's laptop and put it on a server somewhere where it can be managed by real IT professionals. And that's where we get to the first data models that ultimately ended up being the data sources for us to be able to do the more advanced stuff that folks had not been asking for. So I know it's taken us, about 30 minutes or so to get from this high level philosophy down to how it advanced, but you really need to have that context of how you evolve from short-term wins and balancing that with the sourcing and the exploring to really set the stage to do the HR analytics stuff, or the more advanced analytics stuff. So with that, do we have any questions right now before we jump into the machine learning part, Chris, that we should talk about?
No, not for now. But for everyone listening, please do.
Okay, cool.
You've got plenty of questions, and obviously, if you're enjoying it so far, please hit the like button as well. Share it with everyone else, friends, tag them in. We've still got more to go. So, any questions? I am monitoring the LinkedIn live feed, guys. I know it doesn't seem like it sometimes, but I'm here. So, if you've got any questions, let us know, and we're happy to jump in throughout the presentation for those that have just joined.
Perfect. So now let's talk a little bit about how we took this pillar, right, on the right-hand side here, and we turned it into value add for the business. So we're going to talk about a high-level depth of machine learning. We're going to talk about smoothing and hierarchical modeling, which is the basic version that we use that worked really well. And we're going to talk about a couple that didn't really work out so hot for us, but interesting learnings nonetheless. So what is machine learning? I'm not going to give you a definition because honestly, you can go to the Wikipedia page, you can read 3 books, and you'll get like 4 different definitions. It's still very ambiguous. And at the end of the day, it's a semantic difference. It's an academic argument for academics to have. If you're on this live feed or you're listening to the recording, it's probably because you are being asked to solve problems and you're hearing that this machine learning thing is a tool to help you solve those problems. So rather than trying to pin down a definition, I want to give you guys some characteristics to look out for when you're examining different kinds of techniques and deciding whether or not it's valuable to you. Knowing how they're labeled, though, is helpful if you're going out to the literature to try to find stuff. So when I think about machine learning, I think about kind of 4 main things. One is, are you sort of going out and inductively searching for patterns, right? So instead of deducing from top down, machine learning in a lot of ways is inductive, meaning it's bottom up. It goes out to some data source and it looks for things that you may not know are there to help give you some sort of insight. Second is it's trying to predict something specific, right? Machine learning, when applied in the space that we use it in HR, is because we're trying to do something: increase performance, decrease turnover, increase bench strength, increase engagement. So in that way, machine learning is often looking for a pattern to help predict a specific outcome. 2 other key components, more on the technical side of machine learning, are that it gets better with more or optimized data. We'll talk about how more size is not always better, but size is often very helpful when it comes to predictive analytics. Also, feedback and refinement. So either the data or the technique is talking back to itself, which helps it get better, or it's refining itself. It's getting rid of stuff it doesn't need to continually optimize, which is a very powerful part because that's one of the things machine learning does, is it can do things way faster than us. So if we can use techniques that help us get out of the data's way and the math's way, we can get stuff done very quickly. And then finally, it's not explicitly programmed, right? This is not, add 3, divide by 4, subtract 7, and that's your answer. You're not giving it all of the instructions. You're giving it input and saying, here are the things I want to talk about, or here are the things I think matter. Help me understand what of it matters. And so that's another sort of key to machine learning, different than other forms of math that you might do, in that you're not explicitly giving it the steps. You're kind of giving it the ingredients and then giving it the leeway to tell you what is or is not important. So with that in mind, how did we apply machine learning at this event at Verizon? So at the time, I did this research about 3 years ago or so. Verizon could fill MetLife Stadium about 2.5 times. So very, very large organization, 160K plus, which means that turnover is a big deal, because 1% turnover at a company the size of Verizon is almost 2,000 terminations, right? So lost production, right, is a big thing there. You have volume issues, you have increased overtime, which is a financial suck. You have ramp up time where you have to onboard new people. Then you also have separation and backfill. It's a cost to the organization when someone quits because you have to do exit processes, right? You have to interview new people. You have to train and onboard them. It's very expensive. And that's why turnover is probably the #1 thing that frontline organizations are always battling, just because it is so demonstrably expensive. And even small moves in the bell curve can make huge financial impacts. So how did we do it? We use this thing called exponential smoothing. And what exponential smoothing is, and if you have experience with finance, this might be familiar to you. It's essentially a way to use strong temporal patterns, so patterns over time or patterns over records, and good variance to forecast population level behavior. So what I mean by that, if I was going to explain it, is I would say in July of 2019 is probably going to be similar to July of 2018 if we have temporal patterns. It's probably also going to be somewhat similar to June of 2019, but not very similar to February of 2019 or February of 2018. So exponential smoothing sort of looks at your data in time and says, okay, if I'm going to predict what's going to happen in July of 2020, I'm going to look at July of 2019. I'm going to look at July of 2018. I'm going to look at June of 2019. I'm going to look at June of 2018, and I'm going to use those to create a prediction. And the reason that that works so strongly is because a lot of frontline organizations have very strong temporal patterns. So in an electronic sales organization like Verizon Wireless, we sell a lot of stuff in October, November, and December, right? Makes sense. If you have if you're in an organization where you have a high college workforce, you're going to have a lot of turnover in July and August when kids are going back to university, right? These are things that are predictable macro job and economic market forces that are predictable and repeatable. And the more you can take advantage of that, you can use the variance in your dependent variable to essentially become your independent variable. We're not going to get too deep into research methods today, but suffice it to say, independent variable is the thing that changes, right? That we're trying to use to predict the outcome variable, like turnover or sales. So this is a real visual from a real model that we built for turnover. And you can see this rise and fall over specific amounts of time that showed us we could be 95% confident that the data, that the amount of turnover was going to fall between those two dotted lines. And the actual prediction was the black line. And then the red was what actually happened. So you can see that at the big levels, we were able to provide really, really strong prediction to the tune of large groups with monthly terms over 125, 90% month to month and 95% annually. So if you're talking about losing 200 people in a month, I could tell you were going to lose 200 people in a month plus or minus 10, essentially. And so when you think about keeping your funnels full for talent acquisition, you talk about advertising spending, you talk about workforce management, scheduling. This aggregate level predictability was huge for the organization to be able to do that rather than just guess based on what they had seen in the recent months or were familiar with due to institutional knowledge. The watch out here for us, for you guys to take away, is that bigger wasn't necessarily better. Adding more than 2 or 3 years worth of data actually weakened the predictive validity of the model. You have this longitudinal restriction that the further you go back in time, the less similar July of 1989 probably didn't look all that much like July of 2019. So there's a space where you want to draw the line where you get a diminishing rate of return on your validity. So it's not always more is better. It's the right amount of data that you can use to predict, in this case, or forecast what you're trying to forecast.
So do you typically use 1 to 3 years for most when you're doing for most of the time for this?
I wouldn't make that. That's going to be company to company specific.
Oh, okay.
Right. It's going to be depending on how long your business has been in the paradigm it's in. For us, it was 2 to 3 years. In tech, that's changing all the time. You know, Macy's or McDonald's might not have had that kind of rapid change, and maybe 5 years would be better. I don't know.
Yeah, makes sense.
The other challenge with this that you just have to keep in mind is that when the data gets smaller, the variance kind of gets bigger and you can't predict as well. So when groups were smaller than 150, we only predicted at about 65%. So a big part of this is you have to have good variance. So you have to get those good temporal patterns, and you have to have enough turnover. If you only have 5 people quitting in a call center, it's going to be 5 people plus or minus 3. Right? Which is not going to be super helpful compared to 200 people plus or minus 10. So where you're making those decisions and where you're adding value is more in the strategy and less in the tactical, but still had a huge value for the organization. So another way that we worked on this, and I'm going to giddy up a little bit because I'm sensitive to time, is hierarchical modeling. So when you get to those smaller groups, that's where the value really comes. And so they said, we really want this at the lower levels. Hierarchical modeling allows you to split up your exponential smoothing and take it while still taking advantage of a larger prediction. So up top here, the red cylinder is, let's say, a division, whereas the smaller ones are, let's say, regions that are made up of lots of employees. We're confident in the algorithm for the 1,000 employees that we're going to lose about 17 people. Now we want to run this because we want to know how much all the regional folks want to know what's going to go on in their region. So we run the same model for them, and overall the sum of those models equals 14. But we think 17 is more accurate than 14 because the data is bigger and we're more confident. So what we do is we use the relative distribution of turnover within those smaller models. So each of these 5 divisions has a certain amount. So we think division 1 is going to have 32% of the overall turnover. We then apply that number to 17 rather than to 14 to adjust the prediction to create something that we think is going to be more valid. I know that's kind of a fast run through, but that's a way to try to take advantage of the validity of a big model and apply it to the exponential smoothing at smaller levels.
We're not in a rush, by the way, Chris, so you can take your time.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so it's all good.
When we actually did this, we did find that it didn't really hurt our models too much, and that if we had gotten more creative and done more complicated versions of hierarchical modeling, we may have been able to make it better, but it didn't hurt the models either, but it didn't add much value. So the watch out for this is that if you do want to try this and you do find a lift, just be aware it's a bit of a tech and mathematical lift, because once you try to stick this into a backend somewhere, managing 6-to-1 models versus just one model gets a little bit complicated. So just keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So let's talk about, oh, sorry, Chris.
Nothing.
Oh, okay.
Great.
Individual risk prediction. This is the golden goose, right? It's great to have aggregate level turn, but I want to know if Sally's going to quit next month or not, so that I can have that conversation and get her to stay, or let her go if that's what we want to do. Spoiler alert here, we didn't really make too much progress on this. This is still very much a golden goose in the industry. I haven't seen something that does this super well. It's been getting better over the years. This research is about 3 years old, so take it, just keep that in mind. But we tried to attack this in a couple of different ways. First is we try to use a binary outcome model. So in machine learning speak, that means you're trying to predict a yes or no. Quit or don't quit. Get promoted or don't get promoted. Meet quota, don't meet quota. And so there are lots of math ways, things like decision trees and logistic regression, where you can stick a lot of data in, and then it will tell you yes or no. Did that happen or did it not happen? This didn't really work for turnover super well, because it just showed everybody is staying. Because even in an organization where you have 25% turnover, you have 3 stayers for every 1 leaver. So in that case, it was just erring on the side of staying because it was right 75% of the time. And I'm oversimplifying, but that's kind of the gist of it. The next was we tried to make it a continuous variable instead of a binary one. So Sally quit. We look at her time going back when she was 1 month from turn, 2 months from turn, 3 months from turn. And then we tried to look at all the things that was happening in her performance and use that as a predictor for turnover. Also didn't work. It showed everybody is staying. Not exactly sure why. I've seen a lot more success with regression, not to create a binary outcome like a yes or no, but to create a quote unquote risk of turnover, to provide what I would call sort of hotspots. Here are the 5 or 6 people that are at the most risk. Does that mean they're going to quit? No, but it's kind of a place to start. And that's how I've seen regression kind of successfully applied. We were trying to get a real yes or no out of it, and it didn't really work all that well. The third is that we tried an ensemble method. So an ensemble method is when you stack different mathematical approaches on top of each other. So we tried to use a binary classification of, do we think you're going to quit, yes or no? And then if we think you're going to quit, when do we think you're going to quit? So it was sort of 2 different models together that we tried to put together. And it actually started predicting. It wasn't predicting better than 50%, which at the end of the day is not super great. Yeah. A coin flip's not helpful, but it was better than showing everybody staying. And this is kind of what that model looked like. I know it's kind of an eyesore, but all of these nodes are different things that we're doing to the data. That star in the middle is where the data comes in. As it goes up to the left and down, we're trying to figure out.
Screen, Ivan? Can you make the slides full screen so everyone can see a little bit better? There you go.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So as you're going up to the left here, right? We're trying to figure out, do we expect you to be somebody who quits? Then when you go down to the left and you do 2 apply, we're dropping you down into this space where you're going to have a different model applied to you, which is happening when you go to the right, that we say with the train. We're training and applying. You see the little club there. We call this diamonds and clubs, right? The club comes down and says, okay, we're assuming you're going to quit. Let's train a model to predict proximity to quit. Then we take the people that we thought were going to quit. We figure out when we think they're going to quit, and then we bring the prediction out. Again, it was only 50-50. It took quite a bit of work, but honestly, that's part of science, folks. Like, if you're not trying this stuff and failing, right, we're not going to innovate. So, so it didn't work, but it was a cool thing to try, and it was an interesting place to start, and we definitely learned a lot of stuff.
Fantastic.
The last thing I want to talk about is neural networks. So people often talk about neural networks. They're very sexy. We think about HAL and we think about Watson. But my question about neural nets is really, how do they apply, right? Are they really useful? We didn't really use them much. We considered them, but there were 2 main reasons we didn't approach them at this juncture. One was that there are just so many different possibilities, right? The data that goes into a neural net has to be staged properly so that case by case, it can see patterns. And so there are just an almost infinite number of ways to do that. So let me give you an example. You might
give some basic examples for everyone who aren't aware of what neural nets are, just a basic.
Oh, okay. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Sorry for that. So a neural net So a neural net is a mathematical approach that essentially attempts to look at all different relationships between a data point or a data case. So think about people, let's say, that quit in the organization. And let's say you have 50,000 of those. And every column is something about that person: their age, their tenure, their pay, their performance, right? Their sales, their calls per day, their transactions process. You could have 50, 60, 70, 1,000 of those things. And you produce tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of those things. And then what a neural net does is it looks at all the relationships, and possible weightings of possible relationships between all of those columns. So in marketing analytics, you'll take hundreds of millions of buying behavior, and you'll take or buying instances, which are rows, and then all different characteristics about it. What time did they buy? Where did they buy? Was it online or in the store, right? And then you look at them and you say, what are all the different things that go together to predict some sort of outcome? Like, how likely is somebody with these characteristics to buy at this time using this modality? Does that make sense as kind of a high level?
No, that was perfect.
Okay.
That's perfect, yeah.
And it's called a neural net because it's designed on the way our brains work. Our brains literally connect neurons, and the more highly connected your neurons are, the more sophisticated behavior you can produce out of a brain. So that's sort of how neural nets work. But they're also really complicated to stage the data for, because all of those uses have to have columns that all work together. So if you think lagging, so lagging is when you sort of move data across time. So if I think hiring behavior in March is going to influence turnover behavior in July, I have to bump all my data down to and test that. But maybe it's 2 months, maybe it's 4 months, maybe it's 8 months, maybe it's 7 months, and then multiply that by dozens and dozens and dozens of variables. And you can see how challenging it is to learn the soul of your data in a way that neural nets are going to work. So many possibilities sort of slow down the feasibility for that. The other challenge is, this is a challenge HR data has in general, is we just are small. Our data is small compared to other places. Even a company the size of Verizon with tens of thousands of turnover and hundreds of thousands of employees only nets maybe 50, 60,000 terminations to look at. And you need huge data. You're training your data on 50,000 records, let alone testing it. And so
what does that mean for small companies then? Or smaller companies, which is basically 99.9% of other companies.
Well, what it means, Chris, is that you're not just going to shovel neural net down the throat of an HR analytics team and get good things out of the other side. You have to, a neural net is a tool in a toolbox, but so is regression, and so is basic inferential statistics, and so is, good qualitative data collection and descriptive statistics. You're not going to be able to force fit big data models that are helping you decide what to buy on Amazon and what to watch on Netflix, where they have literally hundreds of millions of data points to help curate your experience, to predicting whether Sally's going to quit next month or not because she likes free lunch, right? Like it's just it's a totally different mathematic approach.
Sure, it makes sense.
And so I'm not trying to poo-poo neural nets, but I am trying to say you can't shoot a mosquito with an elephant gun. You have to use the proper tool, right, to help approach the proper business problem. Sometimes if you're trying to figure out who's gonna cut the cord at Comcast, that kind of data is super helpful because we have hundreds of millions of click-through data to look at. But if you're and then you want to call and give them promotions and have conversations about why they're a super valuable customer, and that is a marketing and finance win. Right? Yep. If you're trying to do the same thing for turnover and you've got 1/1000th of the power, you're going to have to use different methods. That's all there is to it.
Yep.
So that's why neural nets weren't super valuable to us at that juncture. So let's talk about the summary of results. So smoothing worked super well. Make sure that you've got good seasonality and good sized populations. That's really the takeaway there. Hierarchical didn't really help us or hurt us. If you get really creative with hierarchical modeling, it can actually add a lot of value. And I'm sure that you could do that if you're struggling with getting the smoothing to work. Ensembles, didn't help super. They were cool. We learned some stuff. They didn't ultimately predict in a way that the business sounds super valuable. And then neural nets we really didn't test just because our term data wasn't structured to work properly and wasn't really big enough for us to use. So the last thing I want to ask you guys today is, what are you guys going to do on Monday, right? Today is Friday, that you haven't done before, which is going to help you and or your organization move toward building or using advanced analytics in HR. Despite being a data guy, I'm actually all about action. I really want to see things change and help people get to doing things they haven't done before. So I have a couple of thought starters for you guys, and I'd love to see it in the comments. So first is connecting with people I haven't engaged with before. We talked about how our team had to engage with IT and engage with the highest level of leadership to broker those relationships to get where we needed to go. Second, source data I haven't looked at before. We talked about pulling data in from lots of different sources, like retail, like engagement, like leave of absence. Second is explore data I haven't explored before. So maybe there's data you have in your systems that you haven't taken the time to learn the soul of or to interrogate enough. So how could you go and do that? Third is connect data sources. We talked about that was really the power of the quality of hire, was connecting the data across these silos. Next is building a new business case, right? So we talked about you have to build the bridge while you cross it, but the building of the bridge is those business cases. It's going out and saying, here's what I want to do, here's why I want to do it, and here's how it's going to add value in the future. And then finally, changing the operational model or rhythm. So I gave you guys that taxonomy, those 5 categories of work. And triaging and prioritizing against that can be super helpful to figure out what you want to do, and also very specifically what you're going to choose not to do and put down, because we can't do everything well. We kind of have to focus on what we think is going to be the most value added in the short, mid, and long term.
Mm-hmm. Well, whilst we're waiting for everyone to post their comments below, I had some people message me on LinkedIn, and one of the questions was around this, which was, could you provide what's your top piece of advice and guidance of how to build a business case? Do's and don'ts when building a business case?
Sure. So I love the idea of building business cases while you're triangulating business cases. And let me say a little bit about what I mean. If you're in an HR analytics role, people are probably coming to you on a daily or weekly or monthly basis saying, I have this pain, right? Like leaders aren't good, or people are quitting, or engagement is crashing, or we're spending too much money here, or we need to pay people more here. And you're getting all of those questions, right? So the first step of a really good business case is to drill and to probe. If you're familiar with 5 whys, it's a pretty basic consulting technique, but essentially it's just 5 whys. Why is that happening? Why is that happening? Why is that happening? And that slowly moves you away from, I have this pain, my foot hurts, to what is the symptom? Oh, you have a thorn in your foot, or it's broken, or there's an infection, right? Because the symptom of pain in the foot is just it's a symptom. And you could produce a bunch of data that's going to make them think that it's solving the problem, but unless you know what's causing it, you're not really going to get to it. You have to balance that with alleviating pain short term. So like I said, balance the build and the give, right? But you're doing that across all of those different things, right? So you're doing it for the engagement, you're doing it for the pay, you're doing it for this. And then eventually you start to see the story across the stories. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
And the way to do that is what? Meeting these guys one-on-one?
It's I'm a big person on business acumen. Like, I do not believe HR analytics people should be sitting in an ivory tower churning out models. They need to understand the way that business gets done. A good example of something we did at Comcast, we actually talked about it, Chris, when we did the podcast a couple of years ago, was the generational differences, right? So we were seeing this pain of weak bench strength, so high level bench strength for executives. And then we were also seeing hiring challenges lower in the organization. And those two stories that on by themselves were painful, when you looked at them, you were like, oh, well, it looks like the way we have our heads distributed across our levels could be better optimized to more accurately reflect the workforce of the future. And so then that became justification for a business case about junior pipeline. So now we're actively working on solving the problem rather than just trying to alleviate 2 different pain points that were actually coming from the same ultimate issue.
Mm-hmm. I had a good comment from Mark Brock, who said, turn off the data and shake hands with people and actually ask what they think, then turn the data back on and see the contrast. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I'm a lot of us come to analytics because we're fundamentally analytical and logic driven. I'll say for myself, I work on things like empathy and connectivity with people and getting outside of my office. You have to go and make those relationships. Pick up the phone, don't send an email, walk down the hall, don't pick up the phone if you can, right? There are just opportunities to build relationships. I call it street cred, right? The more street cred you have with your business and the more street cred you have with the people that are asking you for things, two things are going to happen. One is you're going to learn the business better. So you're going to be making those neural connections between those different panes, and you're going to start to see those themes. So that's one powerful thing that comes out of it. The other is that people are going to give you more latitude because there's going to be more trust. You're going to build trust with people. And when you say this is going to take 3 weeks, they're going to believe you, right?
Yeah.
Which is a really important part of brokering those relationships. And you have to build them across all kinds of things. Analytics touches everything. You work in TA, you work in TM, you work in compensation, you work in employee relations, you work in engagement, you work with the HRBPs, you work with business, you work with finance, because you're the data guy, right? You're the people data guy or gal. And so you have to really focus on building all of those relationships and maintaining them. So I think that's a spot on comment.
Yeah, I'm seeing more and more now where there's many heads of people analytics I'm speaking to that aren't actually from a technical background, but they've been brought in the team to almost translate the story and the narrative from the people analytics team, and then go in the boardroom and sort of sell that message. Have you seen that more and more now? Is that something you noticed?
It's moving in that direction. I think I would say I've
almost
seen
like a business partner role between the business and the people analytics department.
I would say that defines the role, but it doesn't define the background, Chris. So the people that are having success in that role are doing that now day to day, but they grew up in the space of doing the work. If you just bring someone in that doesn't have that a background that's technical enough, they may have street cred in the boardroom, but they won't have street cred with their teams, right? They won't have street cred with the people that are actually doing the work. You need to be able to sit down and look across the table and talk with them. Does that mean you have to be able to be fluent in Python and R and write and maintain your own SQL server on the weekends? No, I mean, but you have to have a level of technical competence that you can project manage, you can sell, and you can accurately sell the story. Nobody hates anything more than somebody who oversells the ability to deliver something. That is the worst. Going into the boardroom and being like, yeah, we'll have that done in 2 months. And then you go to your team and your team's like, that's going to take a year, man. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, we all know those leaders.
Yeah. So I would say the way that I've seen this succeed is folks that are translating to HR from other behavioral places. So supply chains analytics leaders, marketing analytics leaders,
finance
analytics leaders. Finance is not as behavioral. So I'm talking about people that are used to defining behavior, right? So supply chain is about business processes, marketing, consumer insights. They're about quantifying human behavior. Finance is money. Not that they can't do it. I've seen it happen, but it's sort of a bit fundamentally less behavior oriented.
I get your point from a behavioral point of view. Yeah, makes complete sense.
So a lot of our really senior analytics leaders are folks that have been translated over from there because there aren't people that have been doing HR analytics their whole careers. We still haven't quite gotten to that place where they're really, really senior yet. There are a few, but they're a rare breed at this point.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up, if there's sort of a parting piece of advice you could give for everyone listening, what would that be? Obviously, you've been in the game for quite some time now, as it were. I'm sure there's some mistakes you've made along the way personally. What was sort of the main piece of advice you would give to people that are sort of early on their journey, people analytics journey?
Oh, that's a tough one. The whole presentation we just talked about.
Definitely. No, well, definitely that. But if there's one thing, okay, to answer your question, out of those things for Monday that they should go back and focus on Monday, which was the most important thing they should be focusing on Monday when they get back to the office?
I would say whichever is the most uncomfortable for you. Whichever one you looked at and went, I don't want to do that. Do that one.
All of them for everyone. Basically,
all of these are super important, right? If you're coming to HR analytics from the space of being an HR business partner, and all of a sudden you've been thrust in this, you're probably uncomfortable with the sourcing data, the exploring data, but you're probably really comfortable with the connecting with people you haven't engaged with before, right? If you're coming from a data science degree, right, you're probably really comfortable exploring data and sourcing data, but maybe you don't want to leave your office and connect with that IT person that you've never talked to before. I talk about HR analytics skill as the confluence of 4 domains, right? Business acumen, people and behavior, statistics and research methods, and then computer science and digitalization. And you probably come, if you're listening to this, from one, maybe 2 of those schools of thought, right? If you're HR, you're business and people. If you're data science, you're research method stats and computer science, right? Maybe if you're an HR IT person, you have business, computer science, and people, maybe. But whichever of those buckets you are the weakest in, that's the one you need to index on. For me, it was computer science. I was a psychology major that got into HR. So I learned the business part. I knew the people and the research methods from the psychology, but I couldn't write a line of code to save my life. So the last several years have been me brokering relationships, learning IT, finding people that do IT better than me, right, to help me
Yeah.
with the stuff that I'm not native to. So my suggestion would be to think about those 4 circles, find the one you're least comfortable with, and double down on it.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a pleasure as always. Appreciate you taking the time out to share your knowledge and experience. I'm sure everyone's learned a lot, and I've got a lot to get back to do on Monday, guys, for everyone listening. If you didn't catch it earlier, as I mentioned, guys, if the recording will be available here on LinkedIn straight away after, if you want to catch up, if you've just joined. For everyone who's interested in grabbing hold of the slides, and if you want to, you can join the HR Leaders community. The link's in the description for free. Over in the community, we have all of the previous workshops we've hosted. There's an online community for all the members. There's a content library, so you can catch up over there. It's completely free. That we'll leave a link in the comment section for you now. Apart from that, thanks again for taking the time out to join us, Chris, and I wish you all the best until we next speak. Okay.
For sure. Thanks for having me.
See ya. Bye.